This 1905 hospital ward photo looks humane until you read the numbers. At first glance, it is a triumph of progressive medicine. Rows of clean iron beds, white linens pulled tight, nurses in starched uniforms standing at attention. A group of well-dressed benefactors poses beside the beds, proud smiles fixed for the camera. The caption mounted beneath the frame reads, "Children's Ward, St. Agnes Hospital for the Deserving Poor, Baltimore, Maryland, 1905. But when Dr. Miriam Chen first examined the photograph in the Johns Hopkins Medical Archives in the spring of 2019, one detail refused to let her look away. Each child's bed had a metal tag hanging from the footboard, not a name, a number. Chen had been a medical historian for 15 years, specializing in the development of pediatric care in early 20th century America. She had seen thousands of hospital photographs, wards full of tuberculosis patients, polio victims in iron lungs, diphtheria quarantine rooms. She had learned to read these images the way a coroner reads a body, looking for what the photographer wanted to hide. This photograph had been donated as part of a larger collection celebrating Baltimore's charitable institutions. It was meant to show compassion, modern facilities, enlightened care for children whose families could not afford private physicians. But those numbers bothered her. She leaned closer to the archival print, pulling her magnifying loupe from her bag. Bed 7, Bed 12, Bed 3, Bed 19. Simple stamped metal tags, the kind you might use to label equipment or livestock. Not a single child's face was clearly visible. Most were turned away from the camera, or their features were blurred by the long exposure time. The nurses and benefactors, by contrast, were perfectly sharp. They had stayed still for the camera. The children had not, or could not. Chen photographed the image with her phone, then turned the frame over carefully. On the back, written in faded pencil, was a notation. Ward C, November 1905, Dr. Halloran supervising. She wrote the name down in her notebook. Then she noticed something else. The donation records indicated that this photograph had come from the estate of Margaret Tillman, a retired nurse who had worked at St. Agnes from 1903 to 1911. Chen requested the rest of the Tillman collection. 3 days later, she sat at a long table in the reading room with 12 boxes of papers spread before her, letters, diaries, nursing logs, and one slim leather-bound notebook with Ward C embossed on the cover. Chen opened it carefully. The pages were filled with dates, numbers, and terse medical notes. Bed 7, admitted Nov 2, colored female, age approx 4, fever protocol initiated. Bed 12 admitted Nov 4, white male, age 6, experimental antipyretic treatment. Bed 3 discharged Nov 9. The word discharged was underlined twice. Chen flipped through the pages. Bed 7 appeared again on November 15th, this time with a different child. Colored male, age 5, respiratory distress, protocol B. Bed 12 appeared again on November 18th, then again on December 2nd, the same bed numbers, cycling through different children, week after week. She pulled out her laptop and started a spreadsheet. By the time the archive closed at 5, she had logged entries for 23 children assigned to just 6 bed numbers over the course of 3 months. The pattern was unmistakable. Children came in, children left, new children took their beds, but the notebook never recorded their names. Chen had spent years studying hospital records. She knew that early 20th century medical institutions were often chaotic, understaffed, and poorly documented. But this was different. This was systematic. Each entry included the child's approximate age, race, symptoms, and a treatment protocol labeled A through F. The protocols were never explained. She photographed every page of the notebook, then requested the institutional records for St. Agnes Hospital. St. Agnes had closed in 1962. Its records had been transferred to the Maryland State Archives, but portions of the collection were still being processed. Chen filled out a research request form and waited. While she waited, she started searching for Dr. Halloran. The name appeared in several medical journals from the period. Dr. Edmund Halloran graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine in 1896, published 3 papers between 1904 and 1909 on febrile diseases in children. The papers were dry, technical, full of tables and case studies. Chen read them carefully. Halloran had been interested in testing new antipyretic compounds, drugs meant to reduce fever. He complained in one paper about the difficulty of obtaining consistent experimental subjects. The transient nature of the urban poor, he wrote, makes longitudinal study nearly impossible. Patients frequently abscond before treatment courses can be completed. The word abscond made Chen's stomach turn. She searched the Baltimore city directories for 1905. St. Agnes Hospital for the Deserving Poor was listed at 412 Pratt Street in a neighborhood called Pigtown, a working-class area near the docks. The hospital had been founded in 1889 by the Sisters of Charity, a Catholic order, with funding from several wealthy Baltimore families. According to a commemorative booklet published for the hospital's 20th anniversary, St. Agnes served the deserving poor of all races and creeds without charge as an act of Christian charity. Chen contacted Dr. Leon Marshall, a historian at the University of Maryland who specialized in African American medical history in Baltimore. They met at a coffee shop near the harbor. Marshall was in his 60s, gray beard neatly trimmed, and he listened to Chen's description of the photograph and notebook with an expression that grew grimmer with each detail. "Numbers instead of names," he said quietly. "That is not an accident." He explained that in the early 1900s, Baltimore's black population was growing rapidly, driven by migration from the rural South. Jobs were scarce, housing was terrible, disease was rampant, tuberculosis, typhoid, childhood fevers. Black families had limited access to medical care. White hospitals often refused to admit them. Black hospitals were few and underfunded. Charitable institutions like St. Agnes occupied a gray zone. They would admit black children, but often with the understanding that those children would receive different treatment than white children. Not just different in quality, different in kind. There were experiments, Marshall said. Not everywhere, not all the time, but enough that we have documentation. Teaching hospitals needed subjects. Poor children, especially black children, were considered ideal because they had no advocates. If they died, no one with power would ask questions. Chen showed him the photographs of the notebook pages on her laptop. Marshall scrolled through slowly, his jaw tight. "Protocol A, Protocol B," he muttered. "These are experimental treatments. You need to find out what those protocols were." The Maryland State Archives finally granted Chen access to the St. Agnes records 2 months later. She drove to Annapolis on a cold morning in January, her hands shaking slightly as she signed the visitor log. The archivist brought out 3 large boxes. Inside were admission ledgers, financial records, and a folder marked Medical Reports. 1904 to 1907. The admission ledgers were organized by year, then by ward. Ward C, the children's ward, had its own section. Chen opened the ledger for 1905. The entries were sparse. Unlike the detailed notebook she had found in the Tillman collection, the official ledger listed only bed numbers, dates, and the words admitted or discharged. No names, no ages, no diagnoses, just numbers and dates. Bed 7, admitted Nov 2, discharged Nov 13. Bed 7, admitted Nov 15, discharged Nov 28. Bed 7, admitted Dec 1, discharged Dec 10. She cross-referenced the dates with the Tillman notebook. They matched. But the official ledger said nothing about treatments or protocols. It was a ghost record, proof that children had been there, but revealing nothing about who they were or what had been done to them. Chen opened the medical reports folder. Inside were typed summaries, 1 per quarter, signed by Dr. Halloran. The report for October through December 1905 was 3 pages long. It described a study of 6 experimental fever-reducing compounds, administered to 42 pediatric subjects over a 12-week period. The compounds were identified only by letter, A through F. The report noted that compound C had shown promising results, but had caused adverse gastric reactions in several subjects. Compound E had been discontinued after week 7 due to unacceptable mortality rates. The report concluded that further research was needed, with a larger sample size. There was no list of the children's names, no follow-up on the ones who had died. No mention of consent from parents or guardians. Chen sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She was looking at evidence of medical experimentation on children, conducted in a charitable hospital under the guise of progressive care. The children had been reduced to numbers so that if they died, their deaths would not attach to individual identities. They were data points, not people. And whoever had taken that photograph in November 1905 had been documenting not an act of mercy, but a crime. She needed to know how many children had died in Ward C. The ledger did not say. The medical reports did not say. But there had to be death records somewhere. Chen left the archives and drove back to Baltimore. She spent the next week at the Baltimore City Health Department, pulling death certificates for children under the age of 12 who had died between October 1905 and March 1906. The certificates were handwritten, many barely legible. Causes of death ranged from pneumonia to scarlet fever to fever of unknown origin. But Chen noticed a pattern. Dozens of certificates listed the place of death as 412 Pratt Street, the address of St. Agnes Hospital. And on at least 18 certificates, the child's name was listed as unknown or unidentified. The informant for these deaths was almost always listed as hospital staff. Chen cross-referenced the death dates with the Tillman notebook. Every time a child was marked as discharged without a new admission within a few days, there was a corresponding death certificate. The word discharged had not meant sent home. It had meant sent to the morgue. She contacted a pediatrician she knew, Dr. Angela Rodriguez, who had done research on historical medical ethics. Rodriguez agreed to review the medical reports and Halloran's published papers. They met at Chen's office at Johns Hopkins. Rodriguez read through the documents slowly, making notes. When she finished, she looked up at Chen, her face pale. "These protocols were toxic," Rodriguez said. "Compound E, the one they discontinued, was almost certainly some form of mercury compound. Mercury was used as an antipyretic in the early 1900s, but it was known to be dangerous, especially in children. The fact that they kept using it for 7 weeks after seeing mortality tells you everything you need to know. They were not trying to heal these children. They were testing tolerance thresholds." "Why wouldn't they have been stopped?" Chen asked. "Who would stop them?" Rodriguez replied. "The children had no families advocating for them. Or if they did have families, those families were poor, black, immigrant, powerless. The hospital could claim it was offering cutting-edge treatment. The doctors could publish their findings and advance their careers. And if children died, well, poor children died all the time in 1905. It was just background noise." Chen knew she needed to find out where the children had come from. The Tillman notebook occasionally noted colored female or white male, which meant the hospital was tracking race, but it provided no other identifying information. She went back to the admission ledgers and looked more carefully at the financial records. St. Agnes received funding from several sources: private donations from wealthy families, payments from the city for treating indigent patients, and a line item that caught her eye: payments received from Baltimore Orphan Asylum, $240. She researched the asylum. It had been located on North Charles Street, a sprawling brick building that housed children whose parents were dead, imprisoned, or unable to care for them. The asylum's own records, held at the Maryland Historical Society, showed that between 1904 and 1908, over 60 children had been transferred from the asylum to St. Agnes Hospital for medical treatment. 47 of those children were listed as colored. None of the records indicated that the children had returned to the asylum after treatment. Chen contacted descendants. She posted queries on genealogy forums, reaching out to Baltimore families whose ancestors might have been connected to the orphan asylum or to St. Agnes. One woman responded. Her name was Teresa Grant. Her great-grandmother, she said, had been a laundress at the asylum in the early 1900s. Family stories passed down through generations mentioned children who had been taken to a hospital and never came back. Chen and Grant met at a small archive room at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. Grant brought a worn Bible that had belonged to her great-grandmother. Inside the front cover, written in careful script, were names and dates. James, born 1899, taken to hospital 1905. Sarah, born 1901, taken to hospital 1906. Elijah, born 1903, taken to hospital 1907. 7 names in total. Chen compared the dates with the death certificates she had found. 3 of the names matched children who had died at 412 Pratt Street, listed as unidentified on their death certificates. Grant stared at the photograph of the hospital ward that Chen had brought. Her hands trembled. They were somebody, she said quietly. They had names. They had people who remembered them. Chen decided it was time to go public. She reached out to the communications office at Johns Hopkins, which had absorbed several of Baltimore's historical medical institutions, including some that had been affiliated with St. Agnes. She proposed a symposium on the history of medical ethics and experimentation in early 20th century Baltimore. The communications director, a woman named Karen Liu, listened to Chen's summary and then asked to see the documents. Chen brought everything: the photograph, the Tillman notebook, the medical reports, the death certificates. Liu read through them methodically, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she closed the folder and folded her hands on the desk. "This is going to be the problem," Liu said. "It is already a problem," Chen replied. "It has been a problem since 1905. Liu explained that Johns Hopkins had donors whose families had been connected to the old charitable institutions. The hospital's reputation was built on being a pioneer in ethical medicine. "A story like this," Liu said, "could be misunderstood. It could be weaponized, it could damage fundraising, or," Chen said, "it could be an opportunity to tell the truth." Liu said she would bring it to the board. Weeks passed. Chen heard nothing. She reached out to Marshall, the historian, and Rodriguez, the pediatrician. They agreed to help her write an academic paper, whether the hospital cooperated or not. She also contacted a journalist at the Baltimore Sun who covered health and history. The journalist, David Park, was interested immediately. Then, in April, Chen received a call from Liu. The hospital had decided to convene a review panel. Historians, ethicists, community representatives. They would examine Chen's findings and make recommendations about how to present the information to the public. Chen was invited to present her research. The panel met in a conference room on the Hopkins campus. 12 people sat around a long table. Chen stood at the front with a projector, the photograph of Ward C displayed on the screen behind her. She walked them through everything: the numbers, the repeated bed assignments, the experimental protocols, the death certificates, the children whose names had been erased. There were questions. One board member, an older man whose family had donated money to build a Hopkins research wing, asked if Chen was certain the children had not simply recovered and been sent home. Chen showed him the death certificates. Another board member asked if this kind of experimentation had been considered unethical in 1905, or if Chen was imposing modern standards on the past. Marshall, who was sitting in as an invited expert, answered that one. "There were black physicians in 1905, Marshall said. There were black communities who protested medical abuse. There were white reformers who opposed experimentation on children. The Nuremberg Code did not invent medical ethics. People knew this was wrong. They just did not care because the victims were powerless." The panel deliberated for 2 weeks. When they announced their decision, Chen was surprised. They had voted to create a permanent exhibition at the Medical Archives centered on the Ward C photograph. The exhibition would include the Tillman notebook, the death certificates, and oral histories from descendants like Teresa Grant. It would be titled "Numbered Lives: Medical Exploitation in Early Baltimore." The exhibition opened in September 2020. Chen stood in the gallery on opening night, watching visitors move slowly past the displays. The photograph of Ward C hung at the center, with the metal bed tags blown up in a detail panel beside it. Beneath the photo, a placard read, "This image was taken to celebrate a new children's ward. It was meant to show progress in charity. But each child in this photo was a subject in an experimental drug trial. They were identified only by numbers. Their deaths were recorded as anonymous data. Their families were never told." Grant attended the opening with several members of her extended family. They stood together in front of the photo for a long time. One of her cousins, a young man in his 20s, pointed at the placard. "Why did they do it?" he asked. Chen, standing nearby, answered, "Because they could, because the children were considered expendable, because medical progress was valued more than their lives." The exhibition included a section on resistance. Marshall had helped Chen research the records of black churches in Baltimore from the early 1900s. Several church ledgers mentioned children who had been lost to hospital neglect and noted efforts by church members to pressure the city for oversight of charitable institutions. There were records of at least 2 formal complaints filed with the City Health Board between 1905 and 1908, signed by black clergy and community leaders, alleging mistreatment of children at St. Agnes. The complaints had been dismissed. "The people in power ignored them," Chen told the audience at the opening lecture. But they tried, they resisted, they documented what was happening. That matters. In the months after the exhibition opened, the Baltimore Sun published a long investigative piece by David Park, detailing the history of Ward C and tracing the fates of as many children as could be identified. The article led to calls for the city to issue a formal apology and for Johns Hopkins to establish a fund for descendants. The hospital eventually agreed. A small memorial was installed at the site where St. Agnes Hospital once stood, now a vacant lot in Pigtown. The memorial listed the names of the children Chen and Grant had been able to confirm, carved into black granite. At the bottom, it read, "We remember those who were given numbers instead of names." Chen returned to the archives often after the exhibition opened. She kept searching death certificates, census records, church registries, trying to match numbers to names. Each name she found felt like a small act of restoration. She thought about the photograph often. How carefully it had been composed, the benefactors smiling, the nurses standing at attention, the children turned away or blurred. Photographs are not neutral, they are arguments. The image of Ward C had been arguing for over a century that St. Agnes Hospital was a place of mercy, that the benefactors were kind, that the children were lucky to be there. But the numbers told a different story. They told the truth that the photographer had tried to hide, that the children were not patients, they were specimens. Their bodies were sites of experimentation. Their deaths were expected, acceptable, unremarkable. Chen found herself thinking about other photographs she had seen over the years. Smiling plantation owners with enslaved children standing in the background, factory owners posing beside rows of child laborers, physicians standing proudly beside patients in asylums and sanitariums. How many of those images contained details like the ones in Ward C? How many numbers, chains, expressions, or postures revealed the truth beneath the respectable surface? Old photographs are evidence, not of what people wanted us to see, but of what they could not completely hide. The girl whose hands are positioned strangely because they are restrained. The man whose eyes are turned away because he was told not to look at the camera. The child whose face is blurred because he could not stay still, because he was sick or terrified or dying. Chen kept a copy of the Ward C photograph on her office wall, not as decoration, as a reminder. Every time someone tried to tell her that history was complicated, that we should not judge the past by present standards, that these stories were better left buried, she looked at those numbers hanging from the iron beds. She thought about the children whose names had been stolen from them. And she kept digging, because the photographs are still there, in archives and attics, in museum basements and estate sales, hanging on walls in institutions that still benefit from the wealth built on exploitation. And someone has to look closely. Someone has to ask why the child's hands are positioned that way, why the metal tag says 7 instead of a name, why the official record says discharged when the death certificate says deceased. Someone has to refuse to look away.